Hi everyone, welcome to Data Modeling That Scales. My name is Dave Graham with Geist Interactive, and I'm starting just a few seconds early because I've got a lot of content, and I want to make sure that I get enough time in for Q&A. So before we get into the technical stuff, just a little background. I've been creating FileMaker apps since 1995, and I've used every version of FileMaker since version 3. When I'm not doing FileMaker work, you'll often find me on the Little League field. And I've been a dedicated and committed Little League volunteer since 2008. And one of the things that my friends, they know that I talk about the Little League program way too much, and I'm always boring them with details. But I love this program because it really uses the baseball field as a classroom. And we teach values such as character, courage, and loyalty. And it's really designed mostly for youth players, obviously, but it also equally benefits the adult volunteers. And so in this picture, while I'm on the field as an umpire, I serve as both a California District 33 staff member, and I'm the umpire-in-chief at my local Little League in Allied Gardens. We have this little thing that we do, all umpires do before the game, and if you're ever at a baseball game and you see the umpires get together right before the game starts, and each of the base umpires comes up and gives a whack right on the chest protector of the home plate umpire, and you see them saying something, and you may be wondering what they're saying. And it's not an encouragement like, hey, do a good job, you got this. We usually hit the chest protector and say, don't suck. So I thought that that was kind of appropriate given that I'm speaking here at DevCon, and I plan to do a live demo where I'm going to be building a solution from scratch. Most of this work, most of this session rather, is based on the work by Len Silverston and others. And these are the two books that figure most prominently in the content that I'm going to be talking about today. The Data Model Resource books, volumes 1 and 3. Now you may see that 2 is absent from that list. 2 is applicable for specific enterprises, and so it may or may not apply to some of the projects that you're thinking about doing. But one is a library of universal data models for every enterprise, and which is to say, a contact management system is a good example of that really applies to every different type of business. And then volume 3 gets into universal patterns and design. And we'll talk about, I'll demonstrate some of that during the demo portion. This session is not about database normalization. And it's important to understand that, well, let me just take a step back. Every database modeling session or class that you take, normalization features probably pretty prominently in that conversation. We're really going to be focusing on subtyping, but I think laying the groundwork is important. And so in this case here, for those of you who are coming with different levels of experience in database modeling, just a brief talk about normalization will help you to understand where we're going with this. There's a popular mnemonic that helps us to understand the first 3 rules, so-called normal forms of relational database design. And it's the key, the whole key, and nothing but the key. So help me Cod. So Edgar Cod is the father of the relational database model. And arguably, he's probably the reason that we're all sitting here today. The purpose of normalization is really to reduce and eliminate redundancy and then improve integrity in the model. So let's see, yeah, I can zoom in there, but this is odd zooming because I got my presenter notes right here. So let's see if we can, that's not going to really work. So anyway, that's big enough. I think you can all see that. So in this example right here, this is a very poorly normalized system. You can see that the contact information, the contact table, has a single address in there. And so you can't create related addresses, you can't have multiple addresses. And then it also stores a lot of information relating to both people and organizations in that table. Now there's something inherently beautiful in a specific model like that because it's super easy to understand. There's no relationships, there's no complexity. You get automatic business rule enforcement because you can only have a single address in there. And if you wanted to say, for instance, that a mobile phone is required and you have a mobile phone field, it's just a simple checkbox to make sure that that field has a value in it. So depending on the scope of your project, and one of the things I'm going to stress in my talk today is that don't get caught up in it has to be this way. Not every database project has to be third normal. So in this example here, you also see that there's two roles represented. You have a customer and you have a vendor. And in the customer and the vendor, you'll see that there's information that's duplicated also between the contact table. But in addition to that, there are some specific fields that apply to just a customer or a vendor. So for instance, a customer might have a taxable status and might have a preferred delivery format. And a vendor might have tax ID and maybe a current balance. And so in this very specific model that's representing just those three entities, you see a lot of duplication. And so if we're going to take the step of creating a super and a subtype out of that, what does that look like? Now, some of you were joking with me before the session about the party model. And yeah, this is the party model conversation, but we're not talking about those kind of party models. The party model that we're going to be talking about is a little bit less glamorous, maybe a little less exciting. But for those of you who implement a party model in your solution, I think that it has the ability to change the way, dramatically change the way that you develop CRM-related systems, contact management systems. So I came across a post, and I was trying to figure out how to describe the difference between normalization and subtyping, and I came across a post on the Microsoft Developer Network, really hit the nail on the head. And the poster said, think of normalization as widening and subtyping as deepening. And that really struck me as an accurate description, because when you think about normalization, you're going to be kind of decomposing a field. Like, for instance, you wouldn't use a name field to store the prefix first, last, middle. You would decompose that and widen it into appropriate fields to store that data. So when we talk about a party model, we're really talking about a person or an organization, and being able to model that in a way that we don't duplicate information, but that we share a common source so that we can relate all of the information in your database to the party instead of having all this duplicate schema in there. So parties are a person or an organization, and we're also going to talk about party roles like customers and vendors and employees and how they relate to the party. And in addition to that, this really makes sense when you can think about all of the things that join to the party, such as contact methods, which is to say phones and email addresses and physical addresses. Having a single point where that joins lets us reuse all of the common layout objects, and in some cases, entire complex layouts. Not just the layouts, but all of the scripts that operate on those contexts. And it's really going to be valuable when you see an activity. Now, Len Silverston, in his books, he's very verbose in his naming conventions. I'm a little less so. He calls those communication events. And an activity would be something like a letter, or an email, or a note, or a log of a call. So it's important to understand that a party can relate to an activity in a specific role. So you might have an example of an email that you send every single day. You've got the person who is sending the email, and that's the sender. So you've got a party whose role is sender. And you've got a party whose role, one or more parties whose role is in the to field, and they're the direct recipients, that's their role. And then you have one or more parties in the CC line. Now they're kind of included. Their role is, I want to include you, but this is not sent directly to you. And then we've got the parties in the BCC line, which are included, but you don't want anyone else to know that they were. And so we're talking about how parties play a role in all of the activities. This is a live demo. I'm going to create a new solution from scratch. And so the standard caveat applies. Things might break, they might not work properly. That's one. And two is I'm going to be going really, really fast. For those of you who have used FileMaker for less than 1 year, who have not experimented with a party model or haven't actually built a database system, this might be kind of confusing. And even for those of you who have a very specific way of doing things, it may be a little hard to follow. But my commitment to you is that I will challenge the way that you would think about implementing some of these systems. so that if you see something of value in here, you know where to go to find the information that you need in order to implement a system that fits for the project scope that you're going to be working on. And so the data model resource books are ones that I highly recommend, but really there's lots of great authors and highly rated books on Amazon on the subject of party modeling and implementing subtyped solutions. And so with that, I'm going to switch over and we're going to actually create a database system. All right. So we're set up, ready to go, and I'm going to create a new solution. I'm going to call it the party database. And the very first thing that we want is an ID field. And in the ID field, we're going to use a UUID. Works the same if you want to use serial numbers, but we feel that with offline development versions merging in or remote sync solutions, the UUID offers the most value. And you want to make sure that you uncheck the do not replace existing value so that if you duplicate a record, it gets a new value. Now we talked about a party being a supertype and it being either a person or an organization. And the right way to model that is to create a separate table for each of those. We're not going to do that. And the reason why is that most business systems don't have a whole lot of information relating to just the people or organizations. So for instance, if you had an organization table where you had to keep track of all of the legal information about an organization, that might make the case for you to do an organization table. And so we intentionally denormalize this for the vast majority of the systems that we build, and we put people and organizations in a single table. Any way that you can simplify a FileMaker relationship graph improves performance and reduces complexity. And so if it makes sense, and when it makes sense, you definitely want to do it. So in this case, I'm going to add a first name and a last name field. And I'm also going to add a dual purpose field called an organization name. Now for the person, this could be their employer name. And you may want to model this as a related entity if you're tracking employment history. But for the purpose of this demo, this works fine. And also for some of the solutions that we build, this is perfectly adequate. One abbreviation that I frequently do is I abbreviate indicator to IND. And I use indicators in a lot of different contexts. These are lightweight fields. They don't store a lot of data, but they allow you to filter and match relationships and understand when you're looking at a single entity, what roles it plays and what subtypes it has. And so in the organization indicator field, I'm going to always want this to have a value. So if I'm saying that if the field is empty, then I want to default it to a person. Otherwise, we'll have it equal to whatever it is. And I'm going to uncheck and uncheck. Make sure that field evaluates. So now we have a party table that combines a person and an organization into a single table. But in some cases, for like high-performance value lists and high-performance list views, I want to cache the actual value of that party, whether it's a person or an organization, into a field, and we'll call it name display. Now, you might be thinking, I want to auto-enter text field that will be a calculation of if it's a person, have it equal to first and last name. If it's an organization, have it equal to organization name. But we frequently do not put our business logic into our field auto-enter calculations. If you can avoid it and put those instead into scripts, then if you ever are in a situation where you're doing live development, you haven't locked those records and or the table when you're going to make those changes. So we're going to leave that blank. Now let's talk about some party roles. And as I mentioned before, if you really want to model party roles like customers and vendors and employees, you're probably going to have those as subtypes of a party role table. And in a party role table, you're going to store information such as the from date and the through date and which one's current. So for a customer, you might want to know that you engaged them on a specific date, they remained a current and loyal customer for 1 year, you lost them, and then you got them back again. If you don't need to know that information, you can simplify and collapse this model a little bit further. And what we frequently do is attach those party roles as subtypes of the party table directly. But we do want to know who are our customers, who are our employees, and who are our vendors. And so we create indicator fields so that we can not only know if it's an organization or a person, but if it's a customer, a vendor, an employee, or any other party subtype that you might be tracking. So we have the essence now of the party table, but we don't have any of the related data. So now we're going to switch over and we're going to create some party subtypes. And in the customer table, we're going to create an ID field. Now, a naming convention that we frequently use at Geist Interactive is ID. It's just a simple, always equals the primary key. But if you're looking at a customer table, you might be saying, well, how come that doesn't represent a foreign key? And in this context, in this model, we're saying that a customer is a party. And in that case, we're looking at the key as if it's inherited, almost as if it's a shared entity, right? So we start with that, and then we'll maybe track taxable to see if this customer pays sales tax and what their preferred delivery method is. So that's it for now. Obviously, in a live system or a real system, you're going to build out a little bit more information. One of the other conventions that we typically put in every single table is this one field. A lot of people use a constant value of 1 to filter and match relationships. Well, we do the same thing, but we use a number field because the number field allows you to, for instance, transactionally create records through a relationship. And we set this one field when we're creating records. And so for that purpose, we want it to be a number field. But we'll say if self is true or self is false, so that no matter what, if this field gets evaluated, we always want it to be 1. So I'm going to copy ID in 1, and these are going to play out in all of the party subtypes that we build. So here's a vendor table. We'll start with those. And in the vendor table, we might have tax ID. And we might have the current balance that might be set through a transactional process. And whether you are building a full-fledged employee/HR management system, you can benefit from an employee subtype table in your solution. And the reason being is that all of these parties are going to play a role in the activities that you create. So in an email, if an employee is the sender, you might have a merge field block in a standardized address block of text at the bottom, and their job title and their name might merge into that. So that's one of the reasons. You might also store some profile data, some settings and preferences in the employee table. But for now, I'm just going to store some basic fields like employee number and maybe hire date. Probably a better way to model that, but that should capture it. So now we have the basis of our party model. We've got some roles represented in customers and vendors and employee. We've got the party itself, but we haven't yet drawn any relationships. So let's do that now. How many of you use anchor buoy in your relationship graphs? Okay, how many of you are religious about it? You're really going to be offended by what I'm going to do next. So as we all know, with an anchor buoy relationship graph, the anchor is actually the head, and everything else goes off of it, right? Am I pointing in the right direction? No. The anchor's the head, and everything else goes off of it. But remember, these party subtypes we're treating as if they are kind of an extension of the party. And so they're not, we typically don't model them as if they're a related entity like any other buoys in your anchor buoy relationship graph. And so maybe I'll represent it on the left-hand side, or I might collapse them and put them underneath the party to indicate that this is a kind of a special relationship. And when you, in anchor buoy, for those of you who are very religious about anchor buoy, you know that there is one rule that you never break. Your layouts are always based on an anchor, right? Well, we're not going to do that. So in this case here, we have different roles in an organization, and we have different user types. And so our sales staff, they're going to be using layouts that are based on the customer. And their entire workflow is based around converting a potential customer into a real customer and maximizing the value of that. So their layouts are the customer. But in a nonprofit that also has customers, you might have a development department. And their development department is creating events, and they're doing fundraising engagements, and they couldn't care less if somebody who is necessarily a customer or a vendor or an employee. Everyone could be a donor, right? And so the context for the work that they do might be the party table itself. They may be looking at every single one of these. And so what we want to try and do, and let's see if this works, this is live demo, is be able to create a related party and or customer from either context and have this work. But we also want to set those indicator values so that we optimize our tables, right? And so that constant value of 1 is now going to come over here into the customer. How many of you think this is going to fail miserably? Oh, you have a lot of faith. Or maybe you've seen this before. If we delete a party, we definitely want to delete our subtypes, but not in reverse. And the reason why is that you might have a customer who's also a vendor. We're going to be doing a lot of simple modeling here in the relationship graph, including how we create records and so forth. But in a real system, a lot of this logic will be performed by scripts, because you might have a lot of kind of nuance to how things get created and or deleted. Okay. So we have the basics of our party model. We're on the party table. We've got the new record that FileMaker gave us when we created the new solution. And I'm going to open my field picker, and I'm going to go to the customer table. And I'm going to select all of these fields, and I'm going to drop them onto our layout. Now, if I enter some information in here, like John Doe, and John Doe works at Acme, I only have one record still in my database. And if I look at the tables, you can see as I zoom in here, we have a single record. We don't have any of our subtypes yet. And you all have extreme faith in me that this is actually going to work. So I'm going to prove that it does work. And so now if we look at our table count, our record count from our tables, we can see that we have one customer and we have one party. So what just happened right there? So if you'll notice that the party ID pushed over to the customer, and the field, the constant field 1, pushed back over into the indicator, establishing that join with information going both ways. All right, so let's kick it up a notch. I'm going to take all of the fields that I've created on the party table. I'm going to come over here, and when we talk about reusability, reusing complex layout objects, we're starting to get there. And we can see that everything is working here, right? Now I'm going to create a customer record. Now, if I look at my record counts, let's see. We can see that we've created a new customer, but we don't have a party yet. And in theory, this will work in both directions. And so now that, since I'm on the customer record, we still haven't created a party. Still haven't created a party. But now, we in fact created a party, and we joined it to the customer record. Is this cool? Okay.
Dave, where did the key come from?
Yeah, the key came from a magical place. Yeah. So I call this a reverse join. You may have seen this as a magic key or pop back. I'm sure there's probably some other names. A lot of us developers kind of stumbled on this, the ability of the FileMaker relationship to establish a join by pushing and pulling information, and I think it's really cool. And it's one of those things, it's like flying in an airplane. Every time I fly in an airplane, no matter how many times I've taken an airplane, I look out the window and I think, that is cool. And this is cool. All right. Enough about that. So if we took the solution and we kind of put it into the oven and let it bake a little bit longer, and then we pulled it out, it might look something like this, where we've taken in the relationship graph and we've added some additional relationships for vendors and employees. And now let's look at the party, and we're going to create some sample data in here again. Probably should have done that. And we're going to make this customer, John Doe, into, or we're going to make this party, John Doe, into a customer, and we've got that. Okay, do we want to test our luck? Can we make this customer also a vendor? And will it work? Or will it create some kind of duplicate party in our party table? Let's find out. So if you'll notice there as I zoom in, that customer is now a vendor. And the ID from the auto enter calculation in the party table pushed over to both the customer and the vendor, and the constant value of 1 from each of those subtypes came back and backfilled those indicators in order to establish that join. And if we look now at the count of all the records in our database, we have 3 records, and we have 1 party and 1 customer and 1 vendor. And this is the beauty of the party model. Now they can serve in multiple roles, and you haven't duplicated the party record. Now you can still manage the customer-specific information and the vendor-specific information, but you haven't duplicated anything, and it just works. And so I'm going to keep talking about use and reuse of not just layout objects or maybe even entire layouts. So like if I copy that and paste that over to the customer, it's just going to work. And if I delete everything and I paste what I had copied to the clipboard over to the vendor, it's just going to work. And if I make any changes to any of that party information and I go to the customer and I go to the party, it all works. Because we have a single point of context for everything that relates to all of our party types. With me so far? Okay. So we're going to see if we can take this a little bit further, and we're going to talk about contact methods. And so you might be thinking, okay, a phone is a contact method. So I typically would do something like this. See if I can spell today. So I might have a party ID, label, number, and extension, and I'm going to drop that phone over here. For those of you who love Anchor Buoy, I'll do this for you. Okay. And I might do something like, well, let's see. Before the party model, I may have done something like this. Yikes, I may have done something like this. Customer. Oh, geez. Customer phone, and maybe vendor phone. Yikes. How many of you have seen relationship graphs that look like that? How many of you have actually implemented them like that? Hard to maintain, all these different contexts. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag it over here, and we're going to say, this is one step better than that, because now we're going to relate this directly to the party. Pretty simple, easy peasy, right? Allow create, drop a portal on the layout. Now we've got related phones to a party. But wait, the customer says to you, our sales team, they're calling the wrong numbers, and we had a very important account. We called him on his mobile phone in the middle of the day. He was in a board meeting. He got pissed. He decided to cancel it. So we just lost a deal because we didn't know which phone number to call. All right, well, we've got a solution to that. So we're going to create another super type. And instead of tables being directly related to the party, we're going to do a contact method. Silverston calls these contact mechanisms. It's way too verbose for me. All right, so here we still need a party ID to relate to. We need a primary key, and we're going to store that we're going to use the getUUID function to store that value. I'm going to uncheck do not evaluate and uncheck there, all the stuff that we've already been doing. And in the contact method, we need to know if it's a phone, an email address, or a mailing address, right? So we're going to do the same exact paradigm that we did for parties. We're going to do that here. And we're going to do phone indicator. And we're going to do email address indicator, and we're going to do address indicator. We're going to take this contact method. I'm not going to bother with this anchor buoy naming convention for now. And we're going to relate the contact method and allow create. But we still need some extra fields over in the phone table. So we're going to go, I'm going to steal some fields right here and put them over in the phone table. We don't need party ID because remember the contact method is related to the party, but we do need these ones. And so we're going to model this relationship like this. ID to ID and one to phone. You've seen this before, right? We did the same thing with the party roles, like customers and vendors. We don't need to create them bidirectionally because you're never really going to be on the phone context. You're always going to be on the party editing phones, right? And so we want to allow creation here. This is a little bit more complicated. So what we're talking about is creating a contact method and a phone all in one fell swoop, pushing and pulling values between contact method and phone, and pushing an ID from the party into the contact method. Who thinks this is going to work? Who thinks it's going to fail? Who thinks that no matter how many questions I ask you, no matter how badly you want to raise your hand, you're not going to raise your hand? Okay, got it. All right. So we're going to go into layout mode, and we're going to drop a portal on this layout, and we're going to call it phones, party phone, whatever. Allow vertical scrolling, and we're going to add in a label and a number and an extension. Pretty kind of standard stuff, right? So we're going to add a phone. Seem to have worked. Can we add a second one? Seem to have worked. Are we out of the woods now? Maybe, maybe not. Let's put this back in the oven for just a little bit. In Julia Child fashion, put something that's baked a little bit longer up on the screen. And you can see that I've done the same thing for addresses and email addresses as I did for phones. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add a phone. I'm going to add a second phone. And I'm going to pull up the contact method table and show you that, in fact, it created two contact methods with the indicator set. Everything looks fine, right? Are we fine? Are we out of the woods yet? Who thinks this next thing is going to fail? You're afraid to raise your hands now. So 1, 2, 3, 4, some place. Still looks like it's working, right? This is pretty cool stuff. Uh-oh. What the heck just happened? What just happened here? It didn't create a contact method. It hijacked my phone contact method. So we've just encountered the point at which this pushing and pulling and like manipulating the FileMaker relationship graph starts to break down. Let me jump into the relationship graph and show you why that failed. So remember, we're over here on the party. We're creating child and grandchildren when we do this. We're pushing a party ID into the party ID. We're pushing and pulling IDs and constant values to establish those relationships. And if we try this, we're going to get bitten. And the first time I tried this, I thought for sure this was working. I tested it. I didn't find out until later because all of those values are actually showing up in the portals. But then you wind up actually deleting a phone number, and there goes an address too. Yikes. So how can we get around this and still have this beautiful automatic creation of related records? Well, we can't really push and pull information like we're used to doing because we're all like, this is all old hat for us now, right? So we're going to uncheck the automatic creation of IDs on the contact method. And we're going to do that here instead. So, whoops. We could do this. We can get away with this here for contact methods because you'll never have a contact method which is more than one of its subtypes, right? You'll never have a phone that's an email address. And so we can go to the phone and make that the get UUID. And we can do the same thing for addresses. And lastly, the email address. I uncheck all those fields out of habit. It's not necessary in most cases, but I'm a creature of habit. All right. So if I bring back that contact method that was a phone that got hijacked, you'll know when I delete this record that you're going to see it, the phone and the address just disappear from there. We don't want that happening again. Is this going to work? It scared you now. You're like, I don't know if any of this is going to work. I don't even know if he knows if it's going to work. Okay. The proof is in the pudding. Contact method now automatically created and set the address and the phone indicators. And so the reason why this is working where it didn't work before is that between these two, the child and the grandchild records that we're creating, we're no longer pushing and pulling, we're just pulling. And that does work. Okay? No. So the question is, what's the purpose of the contact method table? Let me show you. And do I have another stage? No, let's see. Okay, so let's build this out now. So in the contact method table, oh, I already staged it. Okay. So I might want to have some business rules around those contact methods. For instance, tell me, like, I want to know if I can reach this person by phone during the hours of 8 and 5, and then by mobile phone. Remember that conversation we were talking about? This is how you would implement that. So you would have like an order field that you would sort by, and then you would have a message. That message should be a text field. And so if I go onto this layout, and well, let me just bring back that field picker. No, I'm actually going to do this. So I'm going to create a portal, and I'm going to show the contact method, and I'm going to sort this portal based on the order. And inside the portal, I want my order field, and I want a calculated description of what that contact method is, whether it's a phone or an email address or a mailing address. And then maybe a comment or a message. And so you can see now that this work phone shows up in there. And also, we're going to do a mobile phone. And that's going to show up in there. Not quite complete. Let's take a look at my contact method, description. So, what's that? The fields are too small? Okay. Thank you, thank you. Can I call you when I'm developing? There we go. All right. So we have a work phone, we have a home phone, and maybe this work phone is going to be first, but that's going to be next, and that's going to be next. Okay? And then, so in this case here, I might want to say call between 8 and 5, after hours. All else fails. Now that sales rep that called the person's mobile phone in the middle of a board meeting is going to avoid that because he knows that there are some rules there for that customer. The customer only wants to be contacted between the hours of 8 and 5. And so that contact method gives us some flexibility in setting either the preferred contact method or some rules around ordering which ones are primary and which ones are secondary. Cool? Useful? Okay. All right, and we talked about reusability, and one of the things that I mentioned was being able to copy a layout full of complex objects, copy that to other layouts, like from the party to the customer, to the vendor, to the employee. and having just everything work. So a party who is also a customer, you can see I just changed layouts, nothing changed. Everything is working. All of these portals work, all of your scripts attached to that context works. So it's not just the layout reusability, but it's all of your scripting logic as well that is workable from both directions. I think I took a little bit of liberty. I may have skipped over something. One of the things that we want to do is we want to store the name value. And I think I may have mentioned that we want cache values for high performance purposes. So like, if you've got a customer list, and let's say that you've got 1,000 customers, but you've got 100,000 parties. I don't know if that's a real world example or not. But storing, so if you're looking at a value list and your users are going to be scrolling up and down that customer list, and you have a related name field coming from the party table, it's going to slow it down. So we want to cache those values. We want to cache them on the party table. We want to cache them on their subtypes. And in the same vein, when we're talking about an employee value list, we want to base an employee value list on its ID and its name. Could this work too? It absolutely could. But if you're assigning employees like a sales rep to a customer, and you have an employee value list, and there's 100,000 parties in the party record, when you click into that value list, you may want to get some coffee, because it's going to pull the field index for all 100,000 parties to build that value list to show you only that 50. And so we cache those values, and we do that. Remember when I created that text field and I said, I don't want to put that logic into the auto enter calculation? So instead I use this UpdatePartyName. And in the UpdatePartyName, I define the rule up here, which is if it's an organization, then just simply make the name equal to the organization name. And if it's a person, then for this purpose, first name space last name is fine. You might want to have some more complex logic in there. Now, every single party subtype also has a party record, so I don't need to put that in an if statement. But if we remember, we're creating related records on these subtype tables, right? So if you don't say if this is a customer and you just set that field, well, every time you change a name, you'll actually be creating a customer. And in this case here, you'll see that I used a little bit different logic to store the employee name, because employees, maybe in our business system, we want it to be last name comma first instead of first and last. And so if you cache these values in the subtype tables, you can have high performance list views, you can have high performance value lists, and it makes your job and your life a lot easier. And then the way that you trigger that is on the layout, any field that could impact the name of that entity, we'll run that script on object validate. So before that actual change takes place, we're going to also want to update the cache values. And maybe you're on a vendor and somebody has a customer record locked, and maybe that can't take place. And you might want to have some rules that warns a user that, sorry, we can't change the name right now because somebody has a record open. And because FileMaker 16 allows you to get programmatically who's editing that record, your show custom dialog will be a little bit more informative now. All right. So we have just built in 43 minutes a party model with a contact method supertype and its related subtype entities, the phones and email addresses and so forth. We've just built a working party model concept, and that is awesome. But what are you going to do with this? It gets really cool now. So we had hoped to, at this point, release an open source framework called Carbon, and some of you were in Todd's session earlier talking about the Carbon framework and discussing really what we're trying to build as a platform that's going to benefit the entire community. And while it's not ready, there are some systems that we have built in the past that use kind of the same modeling technology that Carbon will be using. And so this is a client solution that predates Carbon by a lot. This is maybe a year old solution. And so it doesn't use some of the fancy card windows and FileMaker 16 fanciness. But I think it'll illustrate the benefit of the party model quite well. So I have a training record. This is clearly an organizational record. And I'm going to add a letter to it. Whoa. And in that letter, we've got some activity members. And we're calling those activity parties. And maybe we want to add a bunch more. So I'm going to search the database for everyone that works at Geist Interactive and drop them in this list. So let's say that we want to send this letter to Dave, but we want to copy Lance. And it's going to come from Todd, but Todd is too busy with training materials for training day. So Haley's going to type it for him. So this is pretty cool, right? Because now you've got all of these parties, and we talked about activity party roles, right? And in the example of an email, you might have two CC and BCC, but in a letter, man, the sky's the limit. You can have from, to, CC, typist. You got related organizations that party information is going to pull from. And I can give this a subject of I love data modeling when it works. And I can pick a letter template that showcases the benefits of the activity party roles that are involved in that. And so that happened in a blink of an eye, but really what you're looking at down here is all of these merge fields that had some FileMaker expressions based on the party's role in that activity. It's pulling information. And I'm going to pull open the template that generated that letter so you can see the merge fields and the codes that came through. And we're going to step through this because the organization name and address came from this related party, training record. The subject merged in from the subject. The first name merged in from the activity party we're sending this letter to. The complementary closing came from the person who was sending it, Todd. And it was smart enough to know that in this case, we have reference initials. So we know that from is in uppercase, TG for Todd Geist, and lowercase, HK for Haley Kerfis. And Lance is on the CC list. And if we wanted to add some more activity parties to that group, so let's just search for some Johns. These are in the elected officials database in San Diego. Oops. CC, CC, and CC. And we reapply that template. Now we can see that all of those parties that are labeled CC show up in a list at the bottom. So we have all these different activity parties, and their roles determine what information is flowing into a letter, and we can automate so many processes by doing stuff like this. Cool? Some of you are thinking, like, when's the party, dude? Like, come on. I came here for a party. All right. So we're on training record, and I can see that activity. But we haven't yet talked about relationships between parties. So if I was on training record and I wanted to say, show me a contact like Dave Graham, pick that one because I'm in there twice. Now, Dave Graham's title is generally how Dave relates to, I'm speaking about myself in the third person, this is kind of weird. Anyway, so my title kind of determines my relationship with my employer, right? But in this case, I'm not employed by training record. So I might want to, in this party relationship, come in here and say, I'm a contractor for them. So I can type that party relationship specifically. But wait, there's more, because in party relationships, if you're related from the organization to the person, then you have to be related from the person to the organization. And so if I click on this Go button to go to my record in the system, you can see that I'm also related to training record. And because I'm duplicated in this system, I use the wrong record. Let me remove that one and add this one. I think that's the one. So now that I'm on the correct version of my duplicate contact, you guys have never seen duplicate contacts in any of the systems you've built, right? Because my contact record, my party record, is an activity party on that letter. And because the training record organization is an activity party on that record, as I flip back and forth, that same activity shows up for both. And the same thing works for notes and phone calls and emails, all of it. It just works. So I get really excited about this because I love the ability to reuse not just whole layout elements. Like I could take this entire layout with all of its nav bars and all of its tabs and like all of it. And I could create a new party type and I could paste the entire thing. And then I could just add in the fields that are specific to maybe a business partner and remove things that are just specific to maybe a customer. And everything just works. So I get really excited about this, and I get really excited talking to those of you who are thinking about implementing this and wondering how to do it in your systems. And so this wraps up the portion of the demo. And I would love to take some questions and answers. And then for anybody, so
Hello?
we have a mic that's right down in the middle aisle
here.
there. So if you just raise your hand.
Will you raise your hand?
Floor is yours.
The indicator
Yes.
definition, is that the same as a tagant?
It's the same as a
Tag?
Well, you could think of it, I mean, it's just a Boolean field that equals 1. It equals 1 if the indicator is true for that type. So in the case of a customer, it's either going to be 1 or 0 or 1 or null. Yeah. So you can think of it as a tag.
How would it deal with multi-key?
Don't do multi-keys. No, that's an overly simplified answer. I think in general practice, I would never use multi-keys except in the purpose of if there's some programmatic routine that's doing something, I would use a multi-key. But in your data structure, honestly, I would never use a multi-key. That if there's a case for a multi-key, you probably have a case for a related join table.
In the beginning, you showed that you set this field 1 to 1 and used a quite unusual method. Can you repeat that and say why?
So I use the expression self is true, self equals true, or self equals false. So in any event, no matter what anybody does to that field, I always want that to equal 1. So if I say if it's true or if it's false, it will always equal 1.
You used both UUID and ID, and it looked like sometimes you were using that as a primary key and sometimes not.
So so the field that is simply named ID is my primary key for that table. And if I am creating a value for that primary key, you can either do that with serial numbers or you can use get UUID function with an auto enter calculation. So both of those are true. I do use ID fields in the table, and the result of the get UUID function determines what that primary key is for that ID field. Okay, where's the mic?
What's the advantage of using that calculation for 1 as opposed to just putting a hard-coded 1 in the data?
Yeah, so you can absolutely do that. If you were in the vendor session, you probably saw this, and when we release Carbon, it'll become very obvious to you because we actually go through in a DB transactions process. When we create records as part of a transactional process, we set that field to 1, or anything really. We set that field to some value and then test to see if there was an error. And so we use that as a matching and filtering tool on relationships. but we also use that field to create related records. Okay, where's the mic? We got a bunch of hands up.
When like a firm or a home has maybe 5 family members that all have the same home phone number, will that in each party for that John Doe 2, mom, dad, the kids, you have to replicate that number.
Yeah.
And if you're the Duggar family, you would have 17 home phone numbers.
That's right.
And to do the referential integrity for the home phone for the Duggar household, you'd have to go in with probably a script that looped through the denormalized data to update that phone.
Yes.
So you lose some integrity functionality with referential integrity in this because it's a give and take for the performance gains.
Two ways to handle that.
Okay.
Not a new concept. So in the data model resource books, there is a separate table that's called party contact method that sits in between the party and the contact method. It is a join table to join a contact method to multiple parties. That's the right way to do it from a modeling perspective. We have tried that in the past and we've almost never used it because the other approach is good enough. And that is to say that for a family or other informal organizational unit, you would create an organizational record, attach the phone number to the organizational record, create party relationships between all of the family members or employees or whatever people attached to that organizational unit, and simply show the related phone number of the organization that they're attached to. It is, yeah. And so when you're creating mailing labels, for instance, you'll often use this, show the organization's address, and then that way you don't have to go through the effort of setting up this contact method and choosing all the parties that are joined to it. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing address book, Apple's address book into FileMaker.
Yeah, you're welcome.
If you open the SQLite file, you'll see what I mean.
Yep.
But you didn't show us the merge fields. How you made them?
I know, that's magic. I didn't show you that on purpose because I'm actually not very proud of it. This is, as I said, an old system. And the way that the code works for those merge fields is really not ideal. It works. And at the time I did it, I was super proud of it. But no longer. And so what I would say is wait for Carbon to be released, and you're going to see a modern API approach to doing merge fields that doesn't rely on a lot of context and weight in the relationship graph. Coming. Stay tuned. Anybody else?
How does this integrate with Selector connector model?
Beautifully. Absolutely beautifully, because the party table is going to link to connector, and then your selector table is going to have IDs for every one of those subtypes probably. You may have a general ID party in the selector table, but you probably also want to have subtypes, IDs for each one of those subtypes. And so you'll use selector connector, and when Carbon's released, you'll see how we use it in DB transactions to create related parties. So an example of that would be if you got a spreadsheet that comes in with like all this contact information in a flat table, and you want to create all those related entities, that is a pain. It's one of the drawbacks of fully implementing the party model. But if you create these APIs, which is to say these little routines that understand how to create a phone or an email or something like that, and you string them together into a party API that creates the party and related parties and all of the related subtypes and the contact methods and their subtypes, then all you take is this flat table and you feed it into a routine that loops through it and simply uses a JSON representation of that entire row and passes it off to your API script, and it creates all of those related records for you. And we do that in a DB transactions fashion, which is really just selector connector, but in a background process.
That's right. So you want it recorded, huh? Okay. So I think that you alluded to the explanation that I'm about to ask about, but I'd like you to, I think it would be helpful to explain it. You demonstrated something that is often not possible to accomplish in FileMaker, and I'd like you to talk about why it worked in your solution, and that is to use a create relationship to create a grandchild to a child that doesn't exist yet.
I can't tell you why it works, but I can tell you that it does work.
Well, the reason I'm asking is I'm wondering, is it because, it's something that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, right? So I personally tend to avoid those, create the child, and it may auto-magically look like it was one move, but it isn't always. Do you think that's because of the way you're pulling the information where the IDs and the grandchild, and for example, the way that you're handling the one field?
Yes.
Is it possible that that a calculated one might not work the same way in terms of that relationship?
Calculated one will definitely work the same way.
Okay.
Yep.
So do you think it's the IDs?
Yeah, and so we've got to wrap this up. So by the way, this is the last question. So it works because we're no longer pushing and pulling to create those child and grandchild relationships. Somebody from FileMaker that understands the inner workings of the calc engine can probably explain that to you better, but I know that from FileMaker 7 on, it has worked.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so this session will have updates. I plan to post a link to Carbon in here when we release it. But does anybody want the Scratch file that I created? Okay. So I'll post that one as well. And thank you for coming. I really appreciate it and the conversation after. Please remember to fill out your session evaluations and have a great rest of your DevCon.